welcome to a special edition of Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos, live on this Monday in Banff, Alberta, beautiful Banff, Alberta, where the world's leaders have descended at this very moment for the G7 summit. They are talking about the biggest issues facing the globe right now from an economic and security perspective. Have a listen to how that went so far today.
We might not agree on absolutely every issue, but where we will cooperate, we will make an enormous difference.
Do you think a deal is achievable within days, within weeks? Is there that kind of runway?
Yeah, it's achievable. Both parties have to agree. Yeah, sure.
We began the day with a bilateral meeting with President Trump. It was a long and substantive meeting. We are confident, I think positive, that we made progress.
A lot already coming out of the G7, in particular what you just heard from Minister Dominic LeBlanc there. He oversees the Canada-U.S. relationship for the federal cabinet, and he talked about a long meeting that took place between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney. Ahead of that meeting, you heard some of what President Trump said there, that a deal between the two countries, some sort of pact, a Canada-U.S. pact, is, quote, achievable. What, however, is standing in the way? Here's his take on that.
What is holding up a deal with Canada from your perspective?
It's not so much holding up. I think we have different concepts. I have a tariff concept, and Mark has a different concept, which is something that some people like. But we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of it today. I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise, and it just goes very quickly. And I think Mark has a more complex idea, but also very good. So we're going to look at both, and we're going to see what we're going to come out with something, hopefully.
Among the people in the room for that 40-minute bilateral meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney, Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman. Hi, Ambassador Hillman. Pleasure to welcome you back to the program. Thanks for making the time.
Hi, Vashi. Good to be with you.
The president, ahead of his meeting with the prime minister this morning, called a deal, a quote-unquote deal between Canada and the U.S. achievable. How would you characterize the meeting that followed between the two leaders and then the meeting that you took part in with the USTR?
Look, I think a deal is achievable between our two countries. We've got all of the components in our relationship that should allow for us to adapt to, let's face it, the changes in our trading profile with the Americans based on the president's agenda, his tariff agenda. We've got what it takes to get somewhere that is good for Canada, good for Canadian workers, and good for the United States. We're making progress. I think the momentum is growing. I think that's fair to say, and I think we got fairly clear instructions from the leaders to keep up the pace. But look, it's not done till it's done, and we're going to have to wait and see what we're able to get done in the coming days and weeks. We're going to have another meeting later this week, so I'm hopeful that we're going to start to see some real, a real frame of something coming together.
What is Canada's objective at the end of the day when it comes to these negotiations or these conversations?
I mean, Canada's objectives are pretty straightforward. We negotiated under the CUSMA 99% tariff-free trading relationship with the Americans. That's the deal that we struck. That's the deal that we think is fair. The arrangement that is going to come under reconsideration in 2026 is a process for 2026, according to the Americans. So right now what we have to do is find a way to get ourselves out from under the tariffs that the U.S. has put on to date, and frankly, from their part, to get out from the countermeasures that we have put on the United States. So that's our goal. Our goal is to get back to a predictable free trading environment as soon as possible in order to move forward and find whatever the equilibrium is between our two countries after that.
Do you think that's possible, to be blunt, Ambassador? And I ask because the next thing that the president said after saying that a deal was achievable was that he is a tariff man. Is it possible for Canada to see a zero tariff environment and a return to true or as close to true as possible free trade?
You know, we don't have a deal yet, so it's impossible at this point to say what that deal is going to look like, and therefore to say what is possible. What I can say is that is our objective. We've been clear with the Americans ever since then. Ever since we started, we want the tariffs off. We want stability going forward, and we're willing to work with the U.S. on the challenges that they see in the global trading environment, but also their objectives of making sure that they are bringing manufacturing back to the United States, especially from, I think, countries where they feel that aren't playing by the rules. And we are not one of those countries. We are a country that very much plays by the rules. So, look, we're going to find out what's possible as we progress these negotiations. But this is not the moment for us to say anything less than what we want is a zero tariff environment between us and the United States. That's what we negotiated. That's what we think is best for Canada. That's what we think is best for the U.S.
So let me reframe the question a little bit then, just to give Canadians a sense, I think, of what you have a unique perspective on. We hear the president say he is a tariff man. We hear him continue to talk about the utility of tariffs as an economic policy. You're on the inside of those conversations. How wedded is this administration, in your view, to the concept of tariffs as an economic policy?
The president is believes that tariffs are a very important tool for him for a variety of reasons, for raising revenues, for rebalancing trade with countries where he feels that the balance is off. We are very vigorously explaining why we do not think that that is the case with Canada. So I believe that he will continue to use tariffs as a tool throughout his entire administration. That is, a tool he wants to use, and he will continue to use. Our job is to say the economic objectives that you are trying to achieve through the use of tariffs, we are not going to pass any kind of judgment on whether that makes sense with respect to other countries, other trading partners. But what we're trying to say to you, and what we are trying to demonstrate through facts, is that you can achieve those goals for America, for Americans, for American industry, with Canada through other means, by ensuring, for example, that we create, in strategic sectors, a very strong common front against those that are undermining global supply chains, to ensure that we are contributing to complete energy, the president's term is energy dominance, that allows the United States and Canada to really be strong in the fields of AI, in areas that are heavily energy dependent. We can be their best partner in a lot of those ways, and therefore the tariff equation does not quite fit when it comes to us, without passing any kind of, judgment or any kind of perspective on whether or not that is the right tool in dealing with others, because that's not our area of responsibility.
So what would you say to Canadians who are watching this tonight, watching the events of the day unfold, in particular the exchanges between the two leaders, and who feel nervous about, maybe optimistic at the prospect of some stability, but nervous about the fact that a deal did exist and is in place between our two countries, in that the president on multiple occasions has contravened that deal over the last number of months, and would probably ask of you, why are we entering into a new arrangement with someone we couldn't trust in the last one?
Well, because we have to do what's best for Canadians. We have to do what's best for the Canadian industries that are being affected by the president's tariff policy. And if we do not enter into discussions with the United States, if we do not engage with them, how are we to find relief for those industries? We can't just stand here and not have these discussions with them. We need to be working with them to find a path to get ourselves into a position that is going to allow those industries to, to get back to the place that they need to be.
Do you think that path is possible? Do you think that the existence of stability between the two countries is possible? I know that you said earlier that you agree that it's achievable, that a pact is achievable, but do you ultimately think that the U.S. will stand by whatever we end up agreeing to with them?
Look, I can't. You're asking me a speculative question about the future, and I can't say definitively what President Trump is going to do in the future. I cannot say that. What I can say is that we, as our responsibility here, And my responsibility, Minister LeBlanc's responsibility, Prime Minister's responsibility, the government's responsibility, our industries that are helping support us in this discussion that we are having with the United States, our responsibility is to deal with the situation in front of us. And the situation in front of us are tariffs that are punishing some of our industries and causing them great difficulty. And those tariffs have been put on by the U.S. administration. And so we need to talk to them about getting those off. We need to figure out how to make that happen. Can we do it? I think we can. I think we can get to a better place. Will it last, a very long time for the rest of this administration? I most certainly hope so. And I think that, that's obviously our objective overall. But again, President Trump is the leader that he is. He takes very hard lines on things that matter to him, and we're going to have to just take it one step at a time.
I'll leave it there, Ambassador. Thank you so much as always. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Vashi.
That is Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman. Lots of conversation, both with her and the two delegations here from Canada and the United States at this G7 about the prospect of another agreement. The ambassador will head back to the United States later this week for another meeting alongside Minister Dominic LeBlanc. We've got a lot more to unpack about the potential for another deal between our two countries, as well as what else is going on here at the G7. And we'll do that live from Banff with more special coverage after a short commercial break. Back in a moment.
Signed it, and it's done. And so we have our trade agreement with the European Union, and it's a fair deal for both. Going to produce a lot of jobs, a lot of income, and we have many other ones coming. But you see the level of enthusiasm is very good. But the relationship that we have is fantastic. So I just want to congratulate you.
But Donald, thank you very much. This now implements on car tariffs and aerospace, our really important agreement. And so this is a very good day for both of our countries, a real sign of strength. So thank you again, Donald. A really important day for both of us.
Great people.
Has anything changed in the agreement since you spoke on the phone from?
All right, that is U.S. President Donald Trump alongside U.K. Prime Minister Keir Starmer just moments ago in Kananaskis, Alberta, on the sidelines of the G7 summit, announcing sort of the furthering of an agreement they signed about a month ago, a trade pact between the two countries, one that they have indicated will talk a little bit more about what implementation looks like. Speaking of trade pacts, earlier today, Prime Minister Carney, Mark Carney here in Canada, met with President Trump. And ahead of that meeting, the president indicated that a similar deal, or a deal, between Canada and the U.S. was, quote, achievable. What exactly should we be looking for when it comes to the terms of such an agreement, if one is perhaps as imminent as the president indicated? I've got a panel of some great foreign affairs minds to talk about exactly that. Former Alberta Premier and Federal Conservative Defence Minister Jason Kenney is with us. He's now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones. Former Liberal Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister John Manley is here. He's now the chair of Jefferies Securities and a senior advisor at Bennett Jones. And Derek Burney rounds us out this evening. He was chief of staff to former Prime Minister, the late Brian Mulroney, as well as Canada's ambassador to the U.S. from 1989 to 1993. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. I appreciate making the time. Mr. Kenney, I'll start with you. The UK deal has been criticized by some trade experts for, not basically eliminating all tariffs, for the UK to agree to some level of tariffs. There seem to be some indications from the Canadian side today that because of Trump's adherence to tariffs as an economic policy, the same might be true for whatever Canada agrees to. What are your thoughts on that possibility? Sorry,
here we go, Vashi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, my apologies. There we go. We got you.
I wanted to begin by complimenting the ambassador on his haberdashery. His Calgary Stampede cowboy hat is very fetching.
It's for you, Jason, just for you.
Thank you, sir. I think we all know, as the president said earlier today, that he is, quotes, a tariff man. He has said before that his favorite word in the English language is tariffs. And in 40 years of public commentary on issues, it is the one issue on which he has been most consistent. So I don't think we can expect him to let that go. I hope that what we're going to get out of some agreement is a minimization of tariffs. And let's not forget that he imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada back in his first administration. And eventually, he was persuaded that that was not in the interest of the American economy. He dropped it, and he did sign off on the USMCA CUSMA. So there is that precedent. I think the challenge for Prime Minister Carney is to bring him back to that. One thing that the president really seems to be sensitive to is how all of this gets reflected in markets. The fact that there is some early evidence of growth in the U.S. economy, frankly, is probably not a good sign. It will probably be seen as wind in the sails of Trump tariff protectionism. So that's going to be a headwind for us.
Mr. Bernie, if I understood Ambassador Hillman's comments just a few moments ago in our interview correctly, the argument that the Canadian side appears to be putting forward is, look, we're not going to judge your use of tariffs on other countries. You may see utility in that, but our case to you is that it doesn't make sense in the Canadian context. What do you think of that pitch?
Position the government's taking, because that is the truth. We have an agreement with the United States right now, which reduces almost all of the tariffs between our two economies. So for us to backslide on that under whatever pretext is not something we should be jumping into. So I'm comfortable that the government is not responding quickly to the enthusiasm that we're seeing other countries, getting modest relief from the tariffs. We don't deserve modest relief. We deserve what we negotiated, and we should stick to our guns on that. And I'm quite sure the government intends to do that. Although, it's never easy dealing with Donald Trump. The thing we have to deal with really is uncertainty, and we can't provide certainty to our producers or even our consumers in the current environment when there's so much unknown and up in the air and unresolved. It's not a very good climate for the G7 in terms of economics.
Speaking of that uncertainty, Mr. Manley, I wanted to get your perspective on, let's say, for the sake of argument, there is, and it sounds like from all sides that the possibility very much exists, this sort of so-called trade pact that we agreed to. Is that enough to provide the kind of certainty that industry and business in this country need? And I ask because the deal might provide a sense of stability, but we still have somebody on the other end of it who, as Mr. Bernie and Mr. Kinney point out, if I could put it kindly, is very mercurial in nature.
Well, that's right. And as Derek said, we did have an agreement with him before. And his first day in office, he breached it. So do we have a reliable counterparty is part of the question. But I also think there are a couple of different outcomes here, and some are going to be better than others. I think for Canada, we absolutely want to have a preferential access to the U.S. market, something that we have enjoyed with Mexico compared to all other economies in the world. Secondly, we need some stability and certainty. And despite what you say, Vashi, about the uncertainty of having Donald Trump as a counterparty, at least to have a long-term agreement, not something which the current framework would result in, where we're reviewing it every year if we don't confirm that we want something that's more or less permanent. I think that adds to the uncertainty. And the third thing, I think we absolutely have to get a workaround with the sector-specific tariffs. Steel and aluminum and automotive, we need to get those fixed. Now, they had some demands that we all anticipated before the U.S. election ever occurred. We were going to deal with USMCA regardless of who won the presidential election. And we knew that our dairy policies, our digital services tax, our weak spending on defense were all going to be issues, even if Kamala Harris had been elected president of the United States. So we should not be surprised to hear him making demands on those things.
I want to switch gears, if I may, Mr. Kinney, to sort of the other issue beyond the bilateral economic relationship that's going to be discussed and that's mostly tomorrow. That's, a lot of sort of things that are happening in the world more largely. For example, what's going on with Ukraine, with Iran and Israel. There was a moment today ahead of the meeting with Prime Minister Carney that President Trump referenced quite at length, actually, Russia's absence from the G7. I just want to play a little clip of that and then get some perspective from you. Let's take a listen.
The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in, and I would say that was a mistake. You have your enemy at the table. I don't even consider him. He wasn't really an enemy at that time. There was no concept. If I were president, this war would have never happened. But likewise, if he were a member of what was called the G8 at that time, it was always the G8, you wouldn't have a war right now.
I'm sure, Mr. Kenney, you can correct the record. I believe Mr. Harper was prime minister at the time that decision was made. Go ahead, yeah.
a bunch of factual errors there. In fact, it wasn't always the G8. It started as the G7 in the 1970s, precisely to bring together the major democratic economies of the world as a counterpoint to the coordination going on in the Soviet bloc. And so it was a strategic response at an economic level to Moscow's imperialism. And that it was in an effort to encourage reform in Russia, in post-Soviet Russia, that Russia was invited into the G8. That was a failed experiment because Vladimir Putin violated all of the shared values of these democracies in his invasion. I mean, look, in multiple ways, but most notoriously through his 2014 invasion of Crimea and de facto invasion of eastern Ukraine at the time. And that is why Prime Minister Harper, not Trudeau, led the effort at the G8 to remove Russia, and I think that was one of the great one of the great high points of Canada in G7 history. So bringing Putin in, all that does is to create an impossible group to discuss anything in terms of shared values or strategic interests. And I gather the president also talked about inviting China in. I mean, really, look, there are other fora, the United Nations being one of them, where those adversarial countries have a voice, but this is where people with common values, interests, and history can share thoughts on key strategic issues.
I guess I would jump off that, Mr. Berney, and ask you, if that is the way that historically the G7 has been viewed, how, I guess, different or useful is this G7 when, obviously President Trump on a number of those big issues, including the clip we just played, is not on the same page. And not to say that everyone has to, there has to be consensus on everything, but these are pretty specific and specific and consequential issues to have such a completely different view on.
Well, Jason is absolutely right. I mean, you're talking about a war criminal. This is supposed to be a group of industrialized democracies. There's no way anybody can pretend that Russia is a democracy today. Now, President Trump makes it obvious that he would be more comfortable in a summit meeting with the Chinese and the Russians and probably the North Koreans too, because he probably has a similar wavelength with them on many issues. But he does not have a similar wavelength with the other members of the G7. And I'm quite sure that Canada and the others are going to stand firm on this. Trump likes to disrupt every event he goes to that he doesn't completely control. And I see this as just another effort by him to do that. He's not going to get anywhere with it. He keeps making this nonsensical statement that the war in Ukraine would never have happened if he'd been president. Well, what relevance is that today? The war is going on. He's catering to Putin every day. And nobody can understand why. It makes no sense. Thank God Zelensky is at the G7 summit in Canada-U.S. and not Putin.
Hear, hear.
And he will be in attendance at a bunch of meetings. Never, Mr. Berney. He will be in attendance at a bunch of the meetings tomorrow, in particular in Canada-U.S. and Banff. Last word to you. I gotta hit a commercial. I'm so sorry, Mr. Berney. I want to get Mr. Manley in. Last word to you, Mr. Manley. Mr. Manley, are you there?
I'm here. What's the question?
Oh, I was.
You want me to just comment on Derek?
I just wanted you to jump
off. I
off.
can always comment on Derek.
Yeah.
So, no.
You go right ahead.
I think let's find a little piece of truth in what Donald Trump said. It is good to have people talking to each other. It's one of the great things about having these summits in the first place is that leaders get time separate and apart and on their own to talk to each other and to make contact. I don't think that that Vladimir Putin's on the same wavelength as the other countries in the G7. I think his exclusion was done at a time when it was not when it was unaccompanied by enough other firm measures to really discourage him from taking the additional steps that he took a couple of years ago when he launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But I've never believed in the pulling our ambassadors out of countries, for example. I've always believed that at least having eyes and ears and the ability to talk to one another. Canada's done that. We've done it historically, and perhaps there's a role that we could find for ourselves to once again be some kind of intermediary. But I think seeing Donald Trump talking to Starmer, talking to Mark Carney, to the others, this is worth the price of admission, even if they don't agree.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Thank you, everyone, for making time for the conversation. I appreciate it. Jason Kenney, Derek Burney, and John Manley. Thanks so much. We've got more of the special edition of Power Play live from Banff coming up after a short commercial break. We'll actually head over to Boston, where a whole bunch of Canadian premiers are meeting with American governors to themselves kind of send a message on tariffs. We're back in a moment with New Brunswick's premier.
I'll call it this way, it's a love fest in the room, and there's a mixture of everyone in the room, and we just want to get things back on track and move forward.
Now it's time to start healing and having our own individual relationships between New York, our own states, and the various provinces to secure our energy future.
There's just certain things that are outside of our control. We can't control what people tweet in the middle of the night. But there are things that are within our control, and that's where we should work together, and I think energy and research.
Why wouldn't we be working together to build the strongest force that we can? It'll be great for our economies. We'll all win.
Welcome back to a special edition of Power Play Live in Banff. This is where the G7 summit is happening. What you just heard took place today against the backdrop of this summit all the way over in Boston. That is where a whole bunch of Canadian premiers are engaging with American governors on the issue of tariffs and the damage that those tariffs are really kind of ensuing on both economies in both the U.S. and Canada. We had the chance to speak with New Brunswick's Premier Susan Holt as those meetings came to a conclusion. Have a listen to our conversation. Hi, Premier Holt. Thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be with you, Vashi.
I know you're in Boston. We're in Banff right now, kind of close to Canada-U.S, where the president and the prime minister met earlier today. The president was saying that he believes a deal with Canada on trade is, quote, achievable. Is that your sense?
Well, that's certainly what the group here in Massachusetts is hoping for, is that a deal can get done that will see us arrive at the free, fair, and open trade that has long defined our two countries.
When you are having those discussions there, and in particular, when you hear President Trump say that he is a tariff man, is there a certain level of tariff that if it remained, you would find acceptable, or would you like to see them all taken off?
Oh, we'd like to see them all taken off. At the end of the day, a tariff is a tax, and it's a tax on both Americans and Canadians right now. And we heard that loud and clear from the governors here in the New England states that are seeing the cost of this to, well, particularly tourism. They talked about today, the hit that U.S. tourism is taking, maybe less from the tariffs and more from the rhetoric, but then specifically craft brewers and aluminum companies and auto companies that have been affected and more. So we don't think any level of tariff is a good thing. And so the more we can get rid of, the better, including softwood lumber.
Is there a level, though, that, as premier of a province that does depend on trade quite significantly with the United States, you would be able to live with? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. Essentially, everything that I've heard from people who are involved in these negotiations is that is the sticking point. That essentially, as I said, Donald Trump described himself as a tariff man today. It doesn't appear like it will go to zero. So now there's a discussion going on about basically what this country can live with. As the Premier of New Brunswick, what can you live with?
Oh, well, look, I mean, the lower, the better. We have companies that are trying to find a path through the current softwood lumber and aluminum and steel and auto tariffs, but it's having an impact on businesses here and businesses in the U.S. And so the lower they can be, the better. But we'll certainly take a reduction, but they really should be zero because it's a tax. It's a tax on businesses and on their employees, and it's not good for either the U.S. economy or the New Brunswick economy.
And what is your sense in the conversations you're having with, in particular, Democratic governors who are there, about whether or not, that economic impact that you're describing is actually being felt with Americans or by Americans, or whether they anticipate it'll take a bit longer for that to permeate?
Well, that was definitely part of the conversation this morning, along with there's a couple Republican governors who are here as well from Vermont and from representative from New Hampshire, talking about, a 60% drop in bookings at their state park, 36% decrease in Canadian credit card charges in their hotels and restaurant and retail sector in New York. This is money that Americans aren't getting from Canadians right now, and that's hurting. It's costing jobs. We heard the same from microbreweries all along the Eastern Seaboard that are having to pay more for cans and in some cases can't. So we're seeing the negative job impacts, and I don't know that Americans are feeling this unless you're that craft brewer or you're that person who's got a job in the tourism sector at Old Orchard Beach for the summer, and now you've lost your job or didn't get hired on because the volume isn't there because Canadians aren't doing business with the U.S. the same way we used to. So it's having a negative impact. We hope that more and more Americans are realizing that these tariffs are a tax on them, and they should express that to their leadership. And we're asking the governors, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, to speak up and stand up for their citizens and their economy.
You mentioned Premier Republicans who are there, one governor, and then you said a representative from New Hampshire. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the governor of New Hampshire is a supporter of President Trump and did not sign a letter, for example, that all the other governors did, asking for the premiers to attend. If by and large you are talking mostly with Democrats, how effective do you think these conversations actually will be in changing the fact that these tariffs are in place?
Yeah, it's a great question, Vashi. We're all trying to find the ways to get through to the people who are making the decisions, the fact that this is hurting the American economy. And so, many of these governors represent people who didn't vote Democrat or who have split houses or otherwise. But they're also talking with the CEOs. Actually, I've just stepped away from a luncheon with CEOs from the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, with Massport and others, talking about the business impacts that CEOs are expressing to the White House. And so we need every voice to make clear how this is hurting jobs, how it's hurting the U.S. economy, and why the tariffs need to go.
Ultimately, though, there are other CEOs like Mary Barra with GM who are supportive of the tariffs. Once again, the one governor there who supports Donald Trump, who could get that message to him, didn't come to the meeting. Ultimately, do you think there's any way to get Trump off those tariffs?
Well, it's a good question. Certainly the governor of Vermont as a Republican, and I was with the governor of Georgia actually last week as the southeastern U.S. states were up in St. John, New Brunswick, are also suggesting that figuring out how to change Trump's mind is something they're all still working on. So that's why we're looking for Americans who might see themselves losing their jobs because their auto parts job has disappeared, or their aluminum can making job has disappeared, or their tourism job has disappeared, to realize that that's because of the president's tax and tariffs, and we would encourage them to speak up against it.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Safe travels, Premier Holt. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks, Vashi.
New Brunswick's Premier Susan Holt, who is in Boston alongside a number of her counterparts, meeting with American governors all about the prospect of a trade deal between the U.S. and Canada and the tariffs that are currently in place. What happened during that meeting between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump? We'll talk about that after a short break. Live from Banff. Back in a moment.
We all know that there can be no security without economic prosperity, and no prosperity without resilience. And in a world where shocks flow across the borders, that resilience comes from cooperation.
I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise, and it just goes very quickly. And I think Mark has a more complex idea, but also very good. So we're going to look at both.
The important thing is that we collectively think we're making progress and coming to a deal that would be in the economic interest of both countries, but we're not there yet, and that's why we reconvened after the meeting with the President and the Prime Minister, and we agreed to reconvene before the end of this week again.
Welcome back to a special edition of Power Play live from Banff, Alberta on this Monday. This is where the G7 summit is happening. Well, part of it here and part of it, what you saw there on the screen just ahead of us in Canada-U.S, Alberta. A lot of talk today on a bilateral basis between the United States and Canada about the prospect of a trade pact. You heard the president there say that it was, quote, achievable, but that he remains a tariff man. So what does that mean for the prospect of a deal? I've got two people here with me who have been talking to people behind the scenes all day and in the weeks that preceded the G7 summit, and they're going to add some information to what we have so far. First of all, the Canada Bureau Chief for the New York Times, Martina Gridneff, is here, and next to her, Colton Farrell, of course, the national correspondent with CTV News, is here as well. Hi, Martina. Hi, Colton. Good to see you. I'm going to start with you because you are working sources nonstop. I read all your stuff. You know everything that's going on behind the scenes. In your estimation, how close are we to something here?
I think something's afoot. I think that for them to be able to tell us on the record that a deal is achievable, we heard Ambassador Hillman, Minister LeBlanc say we've been mandated to work at an accelerated pace. We're going to see our counterparts again before the end of the week. Something is happening. What I do want to caution, however, is are we getting a trade deal? Are we getting an agreement on a framework of a trade deal? I think there's a lot of willingness to present positive momentum. President Trump is under a lot of pressure back home to prove that his concept of tariffs is really working. And I think he wants to have some good news for people, but that doesn't mean that they've worked out all the details. The trade relationship between the two countries is vast, as we know, and there's a lot to resolve. And the other question, what's happening with Mexico? Remember, there's a tripartite free trade agreement.
Yes, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, actually lands it makes her way to Canada-U.S, I think just a little bit later tonight, and she'll be part of some meetings that take place tomorrow. The first question that Martina raises, Colton, I think is an important one, particularly when you look at the deal with the UK, right? That was the chief criticism. Okay, you've got this framework, but the details are very sparse. And in essence, what the UK ended up agreeing to was nowhere close to the elimination of tariffs.
No, and it still doesn't solve some of the biggest challenges they have, especially with regards to steel. And that's going to be something that Canadian officials are closely watching as well, given how crucial that is to the negotiations that we're undergoing. I think if you look at the subtext of what we heard today, especially from Ambassador Hillman and Dominic LeBlanc, there is a lot of reason to be optimistic that things are moving forward. Yes, we're progressing from where we've been in the past. It's clear that the conversations over the last several weeks have been substantial, and yet it's very much setting up the expectation that this may not end in a deal where tariffs are completely off the board. You know, you heard the ambassador say we're striving towards the best deal we can achieve for Canada, which is the first time that's been framed not as we're striving towards our goal, but we're striving towards what we can get. And that subtle shift, I think, is very telling. But if we are seeing that progress, it's likely because one of these two sides is bending.
Colton's right that I think there was a lot of expectation setting. We interviewed Ambassador Hillman just off the top of the show. Certainly, like everyone is trying to make clear what Donald Trump made very clear this morning, I'm a tariff man. Based on what you hear, like I think it's safe to say there's no world in which he says all the tariffs are off.
Not for now. I think perhaps down the line, if there is an evolution, of whatever new framework happens. This is the other thing. We've seen that he wants to maintain the prerogative of changing his mind. He wants this, then he wants that. It's on, then it's off. He wants to have that power. Of course, that infuriates and really harms the partners. It harms Canada, it harms investment, but he wants to be able to do that. So I don't think we're going to have a comprehensive free trade agreement that replaces CUSMA anytime soon. Whatever happens next, I think will take time. And it will take a lot to persuade President Trump that his concept of tariffs, as he keeps referring it to, it should apply to other countries, but maybe not the North American economies that are the countries, America's two closest trading allies.
That's definitely the pitch that, again, they sort of articulated the most clearly today on the Canadian side, Colton, right? And again, Ambassador Hillman said very clearly, no judgment. If you want to use tariffs on other countries, we understand, we're not going to say that you shouldn't do that, but it doesn't make sense when it applies to Canada. It sounds like that's the argument that the Prime Minister is very much trying to make to the President.
Absolutely. And we heard from the Ambassador that she believes there is progress, and specifically on that aspect of these conversations, not just generally, but that they may be getting through to the President. And that is crucial to note, but it's also important to note the length of time it's taken to get to this point where we do have officials willing to go on record and say we think we are breaking through a little bit in our Canadian messaging, because this messaging isn't new to this government. It's something that we saw the previous Liberal government try to do as well. This Team Canada approach has been tried and true for a long time now. And so if you are only just starting to feel that you're breaking through on this issue, and you still have the U.S. President adamant in front of reporters that this isn't something he's giving up on, that this is a core element of his philosophy, you're ultimately arguing against a true believer. And that becomes very hard to change their mind, even in exigent circumstances or in small, singular aspects. It's still going to be a large ask to ask the President to change his mind.
Let's talk for a moment about the true believer, right? Because you understand the American context very well, Martina. I hear different things depending, what I'm watching. Like, he faces a lot of pressure, but then we're seeing some economic growth and some good economic news out of the United States, which in my view would kind of help to relieve some of that pressure. Like, how much does Donald Trump actually need to announce anything?
Not a lot, to be honest. And I think, again, he doesn't want to do it all at once. In fact, he's playing the long game. He feels that he's playing a blinder. He's holding the cards, he's dictating the terms, and he can push those levers as he wants. And as we're seeing here in Kananaskis, he's kind of right. Everyone's lining up to talk to him. Everyone's perfectly willing to announce something that's not actually a trade deal. It's a framework of a trade deal, whatever that means. So the environment is reinforcing his belief that his tariffs are working. He's not harming the American economy as badly as had been originally feared, and that he still holds the cards. He wants to have first mover advantage. He wants to be calling not only the shots of what's in any trade deal, but when that happens. And for example, we could see a universe where he does some mini deals with a number of countries, and then at a later time, perhaps next year, when CUSMA is actually up for renegotiation and review, then proposes something more comprehensive. But he doesn't have to do any of this right now. It doesn't feel that way. And so why should he?
How do you think that informs, Colton, the domestic political context? We just finished an election campaign where the winning party and the winning candidate for prime minister argued that we're going to stand, it's going to be elbows up, right? I'm not sure the picture was one of where we envisioned the prime minister saying, thank you for your leadership on the world stage to the president. But I understand that there are strategic imperatives to employing that kind of rhetoric. But at the same time, what does that do to the domestic audience? And what kind of runway does the prime minister have here?
That's the big question. How long can this keep up? Because you're already seeing opposition criticize him for, in their words, dropping his elbows and really shifting gears here. But there has been a very concerted and conscientious effort to shift that language, to have a positive relationship. You saw from what the president said this morning, how he felt about the previous prime minister, how personal politics is for him, and how that changes things. If you can build a better relationship with the president, it offers you roadway or runway in order to get the things that you're trying to achieve. And point out those pins, for example. It's a small thing, but the president was wearing a pin. The Secretary of State was wearing a Canadian flag pin. So was the Secretary, the
Pretty
Treasury
interesting, actually,
Secretary.
that they were. Yeah,
And
I think
not
we've got some shots
provided
of
by
that, yeah.
Canadians. That's the,
Yeah.
in my mind, that's the most interesting element of this. There is a genuine improvement in the relationship there, a desire for an improved relationship there. And so if you can keep this strategy going and it proves effective, it works. But it comes at the cost that you haven't got those tariffs lifted yet. There are still Canadian businesses being impacted. And so if Mark Carney, who is at this point in time maybe not as favorable as we've seen polling compared to past prime ministers, but still far ahead of the opposition leader, if he can use other elements of his platform to continue to grow, that will give him some of the runway he needs to be able to get the U.S. to the table and find a favorable deal down the line. But you need to be moving something quickly. If it's not going to be tariffs, it has to be internal trade. It has to be those large nation-building projects in order to keep Canadians on your side.
Last word to you, Martina, on the relationship between the two of them, because as Colton points out, my goodness, the contrast couldn't be more stark versus the last G7 that was held in Canada under then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Trump. How much of a deal do you think depends on the strength of that relationship at this moment in time, like the two of them packing it out?
I think it matters. And I think if they were not getting along, it would be a huge obstacle. So it's sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition for them to be getting along. We know that if the president doesn't get along with someone actively, he's got an axe to grind, he doesn't like them, he's going to make their life really hard. He's going to make a deal impossible. I think Mark Carney knows this. I think he's playing the domestic game versus the U.S. game. Obviously, time is not on his side, and I completely appreciate that. Voters may be getting some whiplash, like, wait a minute, you're here basically flattering this guy. What happened to elbows up? So it's a balancing act. The Prime Minister will have to explain what he's doing, why he's fostering this relationship. Is the relationship itself enough? I don't believe it is.
And he will take questions from reporters tomorrow, which we, of course, will carry live. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much to both of you. I appreciate the conversation. Martina Stevis-Gridnev and Colton Prail. We'll take a quick commercial break here on this special edition of Power Play. We're back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back to Power Play. We're live on this Monday in Banff, Alberta. Leaders of the biggest industrialized democracies in the world, the G7, are all here. They have descended on this province. And this morning, a very consequential meeting between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump. They spoke for 40 minutes, and we just got a readout from the Prime Minister's office just moments ago. And I wanted to convey to you some breaking news out of that readout. The leaders agreed to pursue negotiations toward a deal within the coming 30 days. That is the first time that anyone has put any kind of time frame around when a deal could be arrived at or kind of a deadline toward imposing a deal between the two countries. We heard today one was achievable from U.S. President Trump, but not about that deadline. So President Trump, Prime Minister Carney saying a deal within 30 days. I'll leave Power Play there. We've got a whole lot of coverage from the G7 coming up this evening. I'm Vashi Capellos. Thanks for watching.